Good afternoon, folks, and thank you so much for joining us today for Serving College Students with Intellectual Developmental Disabilities, Part 1, What Enough is Enough Programs Need to Know. We are so excited to be hosting this really critical conversation and are really grateful for everybody joining us today. My name is Nastya Gardelova, and I am the Senior Coordinator of Systems and Training at the New York City Alliance Against Sexual Assault. This training is brought to you by the New York State Department of Health Center for Training and Technical Assistance contract, where alongside the New York State Coalition Against Sexual Assault, the Alliance offers capacity building, training, and individual technical assistance to over 50 rape crisis programs and sexual violence prevention centers across New York State. If anybody has any questions or wants any follow-up trainings, do reach out to either myself at the New York City Alliance or Dali at NISCASA. I would be happy to chat. We've been receiving training and technical assistance requests for this topic for a long time. It's definitely a much-needed conversation and not an often held one. So we're really excited to have a two-part training on serving individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. This is part 1 of 2, and part 2, for which registration will be going out following today's webinar, is going to be held on Friday, May 3rd at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Can I just make sure, is everybody hearing me? I'm getting a couple messages that folks are not. Can you hear me, Kat?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. I think for folks who cannot hear, you need to call in as well as listening to the kind of ready talk function. So like I said, Part 2 registration will be going out soon. That'll be Friday, May 3rd, and that'll be on practical applications of what we kind of talk about today with Kat, so what enough providers need to do in their prevention and direct service work. So as this is such an important topic, we are devoting an hour and a half to it today. I really hope that folks can stick with us throughout this important conversations, and we welcome you to be sending in questions through the chat function. We're going to be saving time at the end to chat through them all with Kat. So I'm really thrilled to introduce our wonderful speaker for both today's training and the one in May. Kat Fazey is a residential director and sexuality specialist located in New York. Kat is the founder of Inclusive Sexology, a consulting company that provides information, education, and counseling services to people about sexuality and IDD. Having worked in the field of IDD for over 10 years, Kat has seen the need for improved sexuality services. For the past 5, Kat's worked to counsel, educate, and train professionals, families, and individuals with IDD in a variety of areas of sexuality. Originally from the UK, Kat received her bachelor's in psychology with neuropsychology from the University of North Wales and continued her education in the US, obtaining her master's in social work from the Silberman School at Hunter College. Kat is currently working towards her LCSW and is currently enrolled in the Human Sexuality PhD program at Widener, where she also earned a Master's in Education in Human Sexuality and expects her PhD in 2020. Kat leads CEU-approved sexuality trainings for professionals working with people with IDD in New York City. And for more information about Kat or the trainings that she provides, her email is inclusivesexology@gmail.com, and that's going to be on your screens at the end of the webinar as well. So like I said, please feel free to send your questions along through the chat box. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Kat. Thank you so much, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Nastya. I appreciate all of that. So this is sort of a new way of presenting to me because I can normally at least see some of your faces. So please use the raise your hand function or ask questions if you're confused because this is a topic that is not talked about often enough. You might be a little confused about a couple of things, or you might have some really important questions. So please feel free to make those be known so that you get the most out of this webinar. So we're going to start, so all of part 1 today, we're mainly going to be focusing on sort of what intellectual and developmental disability is, how sexuality is a part of someone's life if they have a diagnosis of an intellectual or developmental disability, and how we might as providers think to start supporting that. And then in part 2, we'll focus more on practical applications of things that you can actually do in your role as Enough is Enough providers. So to start, I thought we would go over a couple facts and myths. There are several myths out there, and so I just want to make sure we're kind of all on the same page about a few of these things. So let's see. If you believe that this is a fact, if you could hit your hand raise function so I can see what people think. So if you think it's a fact, hit the hand raise function. So people with IDD do not develop sexually at the same rate as their neurotypical peers. If you think that is a fact, hit the hand raise button. Okay, so no hands raised. So people with intellectual and developmental disability do in fact develop exactly the same as people, their neurotypical peers. Hormones, biology, all of that is completely separate for the most part. So in the same way that for neurotypical people, there might be a range on things like the onset of puberty or how people's hormones are interacting with their body, that is exactly the same for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Okay, so again, if you think this is a fact, please raise your hand. People with IDD have the same sexual wants, needs, and desires as neurotypical people. Oh, look at that, lots of hands raised. Perfect. Yes, they do indeed have the same sexual wants, needs, and desires. And similarly, that there again is a huge variety in how much sex people want, or if they want to have sex at all, or if they view themselves different sexual identities, different gender identities, all of those things, that whole range is exactly the same for people with intellectual and developmental disability. Raise your hand again if you think it's a fact. People with IDD are at a lower risk of experiencing sexual abuse. So I think the few hands that were raised are hands that have just not gone down from the first one. So we'll talk more about the actual statistics, but people with IDD are much more likely to experience sexual abuse. We are starting to see those statistics change slightly, but only ever so slightly, and they are at about 3 times greater likelihood of experiencing sexual abuse than neurotypical people in general. Okay, people with IDD are not capable of providing sexual consent. If you think that is a fact, please raise your hand. You guys are coming to this with a lot of education already, because you are absolutely correct. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities might not all be capable of providing sexual consent, but neither are all neurotypical people. And we're going to talk more about the laws surrounding sexual consent for people with IDD, because they are very, very different than for the neurotypical population. And it varies, unfortunately, state by state. So depending on where people come from or where you're providing service, that might affect what the laws are. Okay, so we're going to move along. Okay, so in the DSM-5, neurodevelopmental disorders is the category that we kind of think of now. And in this category, there are several types of disorders or disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, communication disorders, autism spectrum disorders, specific learning disorders, motor disorders, or other neurodevelopmental disorders. For the most part, these are just words because they look very different on every single person that might receive that diagnosis. So although having a label can be useful for obtaining services in a school setting, it's very hard to read a diagnosis and just assume you know something about the person based on that and that alone. So in order for someone to be diagnosed with intellectual or developmental disability, there have to be deficits in 3 different criteria. So intellectual functioning is one criteria, and you have to have struggles in at least 2 of these areas. So either reasoning, problem solving, abstract thinking, judgment, etc. You need at least 2 of those. There have to be deficits in adaptive functioning, so communication, social skills, personal independence or personal care, like how well you can take care of your body, how well you can clean or cook for yourself, how safe you'd be to be left alone, if you would know to call the police for help, those sorts of things. And then school or work functioning. And then these have to occur in the developmental period, so prior to the age of 21 in America, for it to count as a developmental disability. So we might see people who present with very similar behaviors or very similar concerns that might be the result of a traumatic brain injury. But if that happens outside of the developmental period, if it happens over the age of 21, it is viewed slightly differently, even if it presents itself in the exact same way. Just reading some of these comments to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay. So language. Language is really, really important, as we all hopefully know, and language changes frequently in this field and every other field. So historically, we've used words like moron, we've used words like idiot to describe people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Up until fairly recently, the term mental retardation was used clinically to describe the population. And so you might still work with some people who have mental retardation in a file somewhere that it's been used to be written about them. We really try hard to not use that language at all, and even if we read it in a file, it's not something that we would be using to talk about or describe a person that we're trying to work with and support. So neurotypical or neurodiverse are words that are more commonly used in the profession, but it's best to just ask the person themselves, how do you define yourself? How do you identify? Excuse me. So again, with language, there are different schools of thought on language and how we should talk about people with disabilities. So there is either the people-first model or there is the identity-first model. So in America currently, the people-first model is currently used the majority of the time. So you can see some of those examples: person with a disability, person with autism, as opposed to disabled person or autistic person. This is sort of being challenged a little bit right now. So if you're somebody from the deaf community for a long time has said, nope, it's who I am. Like, being deaf is an intrinsic part of who I am. I am a deaf person. I do not want to be referred to as anything other than that. And so that has sort of, for the most part, fallen into common speech patterns, and that is how we refer to the deaf community. Other groups of people are feeling the same way. So when they moved the DSM criteria for autism spectrum disorder, they removed the label of Asperger's. A lot of people who have Asperger's love the label Asperger's, and it's part of them, and it's something they're proud of. You might hear the term ASPE. There's a lot of ASPE groups, and people will describe themselves as being an ASP or being ASPE. Now, none of these things are true across the board, and none of these things are true for all people. So truly the best thing you can do is ask the question, just like we would in other, if we're asking people about their pronouns or things like that, so that we know that we're not making assumptions and that we're really addressing people the way that they would like to be addressed. Okay, so where do people get their information from? When we think about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and sex and sex education, there really isn't a lot of formal sex education out there right now aimed specifically at this population. So when we think for ourselves, where we learn some of that information, maybe we got it from family, maybe we got it from social media if you're a little younger, maybe you got it from religion or from school or from your friends. But what do we think? Like, if maybe someone could unmute themselves or type in the box, where do you think people with disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, get the majority of their sexual information from? Okay, so people are saying the media, YouTube, social media. And what kind of messages do you think people get from social media or the media in general? Right, a lot of things online, so it's misleading. There could be more negative messages than positive. So we really have to think about what we see online, and what we see in the media in general. When you look at the people who are in movies or the people who are on the front of magazines, they, for the most part, aren't people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. They, for the most part, aren't people with physical disabilities. And so people learn from a very early age that they're not attractive, that they don't fit in, that some of these things aren't meant for them. In the last couple years, there have been a couple attempts by different TV shows to address the issue of sexuality and disability. There's a show on Netflix called Atypical that springs to mind right now that talks about a teenage boy with Asperger's who is, trying to date and trying to figure out romance and sex and sexuality and trying to figure that out for himself. And it's done in a sort of lighthearted, kind of playful way, but there are very few examples of that out there. So if you're constantly seeing people who don't look like you, who don't sound like you, who don't don't really represent you. And when you do see people that represent you or that look like you, it's only in either a victim role or like a support role. You're like the funny friend on the side that is brought in, for like the sympathy vote or something. You're not really a main character. The other thing with the media, so I did a workshop for young men with autism recently, and we spent a good 4 hours talking about porn. And so it was clear that they all had a lot of experience with knowing how to access it, knowing what sites they liked. They had a good understanding about the safety of, child porn is not legal and all that kind of thing. But when I asked them, how long do you think sex lasts typically between two heterosexual people? How long do you think that normally goes on for? The answers I got were ranging from 45 minutes to 2.5 hours, because they're basing it off of the porn movie that they like and not understanding that what they're seeing is, the media, and it's fake, and it's been put together, and it wasn't filmed in one long shot, and it was different people, and all of those pieces sort of escape them. And because they don't have anybody to talk to about it, and because they didn't have their own actual experience to compare it to, there was nothing to sort of challenge that viewpoint. So they're seeing these things and they're learning them as fact without being able to have anyone question that or challenge that. When it comes to religion, there's something called a marriage tax in the U.S. right now. So if people with intellectual or developmental disabilities receive benefits, if they get married, they lose 50% of their benefits. So for people like me who are neurotypical, if I get married, I get a lot of benefits, right? I get a lot of perks. I can receive my spouse's health insurance potentially. I can, there are tax breaks and things like that, and we're rewarded for becoming married and for subscribing to this normal social thing that we're supposed to do. But for people with IDD, if they get married, they're actually punished. And that comes from a religious background and a religious standpoint, but is still very much the law today. So that's another negative messages that are being shown to people. Family, for the most part, family is an interesting place where people get information. There's a lot of variety, just like there would be for neurotypical people. Some families are very uncomfortable and you don't talk about sex, and you turn the TV off if there's a sex scene and things like that. Other families are much more open and feel more comfortable talking about those issues. But unfortunately, as we talk more about sexual assault and abuse, family members are often fairly high in the perpetrators of abusing people with disabilities. So family is kind of a complex thing, and it really kind of depends situation to situation. When it comes to school, up until very recently, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were routinely removed from health education classes when sex became the topic. That definitely still happens today, but it's starting to happen less. And there are very few schools that have a specific curriculum aimed at the different learning needs that students with disabilities might have. And so even if they are kept in the classroom to receive the education, it's not presented to them in a way that they can fully understand. And so they might leave with more questions than they had in the beginning, or they might misinterpret things. When when condom demonstrations weren't allowed and people were getting really creative with like, I'm going to show you how to put a sock on my foot, or we're going to use these bananas because we can't use penis models in the classroom. Things like that can be really confusing to people with different types of IDD. There's actually a couple that I know of who both have Down syndrome, and they were shown how to put a condom on a banana, and so that's exactly what they did. They put a condom on a banana, and the outcome of that was not great. And it was sad because they'd sought out the education, they'd gone to a proper sex ed class to get that education, and because it wasn't taught to them in a way that made sense to them, they didn't actually get the education they needed, and the outcome was not great for them. So that is changing slightly, but there are still very few curricula out there that really address those needs. When it comes to friends, people's friends, depending on the environment that the person grows up in, it might be that a lot of their friends are other people with disabilities. So if you think back to when you were growing up or when you were in high school or in college, friends talk and share information, and, different friends have different experiences, and you kind of learn together as a group as you go. If your friends are also people who are kind of excluded and on the outside of that, then misinformation can spread really, really easily and not be corrected. And then if they're friends with neurotypical people, there is a chance for exploitation or manipulation because of their limited lack of understanding in this area. So people can get tricked into doing things that they shouldn't be doing because they don't know any better. Okay, so it's important for providers to understand not just what to do and how to respond in situations, but also to understand sort of like the background and the social or sexual issues that people might face so that you can better support them when situations arise. So it's important for you to have some of this information because you're often the ones on the front line working with them. You know, you need to help educate people with IDD and those who support them. If things are coming up, a behavior that is often brought to my attention in school settings is stalking behaviors. You know, and it might become your job at some point to help educate someone of what that really means and what the consequences are, because if they haven't been taught that before, or they're basing their actions off of a romantic comedy that they've seen, which often include kind of stalking behaviors, but we don't frame it that way. You know, it's great on a movie if someone stands outside a room with a boombox and sings a song and it's all romantic. But if you're doing that, you know, it can be interpreted very differently. So you might need to help support and educate in those types of times. Acting as an advocate is always important. Identifying where abuse could potentially take place. Educating other students and other people in the communities that you're in. And being mindful when you're providing prevention education across the campus that you're thinking about everybody who's a part of that community so that you can tailor some of that education to better meet the needs of everybody and not just the neurotypical people that you're supporting. Okay, so sexual assault. Unfortunately, studies show that as many as 83% of women with IDD and 32% of males with IDD are victims of sexual assault. That is a really, really high number, a shocking number. They are 7 times more likely to experience sexual harassment and assault than neurotypical folk. And almost 100% of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities that experience sexual assault know their abuser. And in those cases, 44% of those, the relationship is a caring relationship. So it's a caregiver, a staff support, a transportation provider. I know a young woman who recently got her PhD actually in education, who has a lot of physical disabilities, and she lived in a ADA on-campus housing, and she had someone who would come to her apartment and help get her ready, take her to class, and would take notes for her in class. The person who was doing that for her was a male, and he, at some point during their sort of professional relationship, decided that he could really take control and manipulate this person. So he started to threaten her. She had a breathing tube, so if she wasn't connected to her breathing tube, she couldn't breathe and, you know, would die for sure. So he would threaten to turn the breathing tube off. He would make all sorts of terrible, awful threats if she did not provide him sexual favors or sexual gratification. He would refuse to take her out of her apartment and tell the school, like, oh, she's not feeling well today. He would refuse to take notes for her so she wouldn't do as well in class unless she was willing to provide different sexual acts, which clearly, hopefully to all of you, is horribly abusive and horribly manipulative. But this woman, you know, she just got her PhD. She's clearly very, very intelligent, but didn't feel like she would be supported by the school she was at, didn't feel like people would believe her. The gentleman who was coming over was sort of like a college all-star, you know, like he was very well known for some sort of sport, and he was just like a very kind of popular, well-liked guy, and she just didn't think that people would believe her, and he played into that and said, you know, no one's going to believe that I would want to have sex with someone who looks like you. No one's going to ever believe you. And so as providers in a college setting, we would want to make sure that we're really looking out for things like that and really making sure that any accommodations we're providing to people with disabilities, that we're really checking in with them and that we're not isolating them so that they only have one person to talk to, but that they can reach out to help in multiple avenues if if that's something they need to do. So sexual assault is more prevalent for those with IDD than those who are neurotypical. About 1.3 million violent victimizations, which is very high. Serious violent victimization were more than 3 times higher for people with disabilities, and people with cognitive disabilities or IDD had the highest rate of violent victimization. The percentage of violence against people with disabilities committed by intimate partners was 15%, which is higher than in the neurotypical population. And then in 2013, this was increased slightly, but in 2013, 41% of violence against people with IDD was committed by people they knew well or by casual acquaintances. When working with people, and we'll get more into this in part 2, but I like to make sure that whenever I'm doing any kind of counseling or support with anyone with a disability, I like to make sure that they can identify 5 different people in their life that they would reach out to for help. Because people often know the person that's abusing them, just having a family member isn't enough. Because if you're being abused by a family member, maybe you're not going to tell mom or dad because maybe they're not going to believe that uncle whoever or whoever this other person is doing that abuse. If it's happening at school, maybe the school won't believe you. If it's happening in a doctor's office, maybe they're not going to believe you. So I like to have people identify at least 5 people from 5 different areas of their life. So a home person, a school person, a friend, a clinician, a doctor, just 5 different areas of life so that if something's happening in one area, there are other people they trust that they can go to. And that can be really, really huge. So why are people with IDD at such a high risk? There are many reasons why they're at a high risk. A lot of it is lack of education. So when we think about, the education that we're trying to provide to neurotypical kids in school, and there's a lot of lobbying to have more comprehensive sex ed from a younger age, we do that so that people can be protected. If you genuinely have never been taught what sex or sexual assault or abuse is, and if somebody in your life is telling you that that's okay, then you might not realize that what's happening is wrong. There's a lot of myths surrounding the sexuality of the population. So there's a lot of times that people don't believe that assault or abuse has happened because they think, well, but they're not really sexual, or that they're over-sexualized and must have wanted it. I did a lot of work for the Special Victims Unit in Brooklyn, and would stand in court as like an expert witness and do consent determinations for people. And there was a lot of questions would be brought up, sort of like, well, this guy must be guilty because he's 6'2" and weighs 200 pounds, and he has an intellectual disability, so he has to be guilty. And then on the flip side, well, we don't believe she's telling the truth because who would want to have sex with someone who looked like that? Like, why, if you were going to rape someone, why would you rape someone who, looked like that? But hopefully the people I'm talking to right now understand that, people who commit sexual assault, it's not about what the person looks like. It's about power and control and things like that. So, it's just unfortunate that because of these myths, people are often not believed. A lack of advocacy skills, so not knowing how to fight for your rights or stand up and say this thing is happening and it's not okay. Can be very vulnerable to manipulation and exploitation. So the story I told you about the woman in college who was receiving support and then was being sexually abused. And this went on, by the way, for almost 2 years of her college experience before she finally was able to tell someone. The guy had it was an easy target to approach this woman because he was able to manipulate and exploit her. Education is very important to her, and she wanted those notes, and she wanted to get to class, and she wanted to do all of those things, and he was able to manipulate her into believing that nobody would believe her. And that kind of ties into having an over-reliance on caregivers and professionals also. Trained compliance is another big issue. So when people with IDD are younger, we teach them to conform to what we want them to do. So kids who are on the spectrum might display different types of stemming behaviors. So maybe they kind of jump up and down or roll up and down on the balls of their feet. maybe they flap their hands a little, maybe they put their hands in their fingers in their ears, and people spend a lot of time training that out of them because we want them to fit into our world rather than, us bending to fit into their world. And so we teach children very early on that they just have to be compliant and they have to do what other people are telling them to do, and that neurotypical people have the power and you just have to go along with them. So that trained compliance from a young age absolutely transfers into young adulthood and adulthood. And if somebody in power tells people to do something, there is a higher likelihood that they'll just say yes because they don't recognize or fully understand that they have the same rights as everybody else to say no. And then skin hunger is a sort of psychological idea that human beings need to be touched. Everybody needs to be touched and to feel touch in some way or another. And so if you're not receiving a lot of touch and affection, you can start to experience skin hunger, where this psychological need to feel human touch becomes stronger and stronger. And so you might make decisions that are not the best or the safest or the healthiest for you just to have that need met. And that comes as a function of professionals. When college kids are younger, professionals are taught, like, we don't want to confuse them, we don't want to blur boundaries, so we don't hug people, we don't touch people, we wave, maybe you get a high five. But because providers are sometimes so afraid that they might be accused of abuse in some way, we're taught, like, you just don't touch people at all. And that can lead to people seeking out that touch in other places. A question about reporting rates. Yes, the reporting rates within IDD communities are very much lower than in neurotypical communities. So OPWDD, that's the agency that provides, it's the Office for People with Developmental Disabilities. They have the Justice Center, which hopefully you're aware of, that you call to report any kind of incident of abuse, not just sexual. And I'm always shocked and surprised by how many times those calls are made and are not followed through with properly, especially if it's two people with disabilities that are involved. So if one person with a disability makes an accusation or an allegation against another person with a disability, it's very rarely followed through to the fullest extent of the law. And it's just sort of blown off as, well, they didn't know any better, so no big deal, which is really, really, really disheartening. And when people kind of see that and recognize that, it makes them less likely to report in the future. So for this population, there's a huge history of sexual oppression. So the ugly laws were in place until the 1970s. And the ugly laws were when you could get fined a pretty substantial fee for just being too disabled and too unattractive. So if you went out to eat dinner or something and people thought you were too ugly to look at because of your disability, you could be asked to leave and you could be fined, which obviously sends a terrible message that, if I'm not good enough to sit and have a meal in front of you, like, I'm certainly not someone that you're viewing as a potential sexual interest. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes famously said that 3 generations of idiots are enough, based off of one family where 3 women in the family, the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, all had a different type of disability. So he felt like that was science enough to say that, all people with disabilities, like, if they keep procreating, they're just going to have more disabled people, and then we have to take care of them, and we don't want to do that. So then forced sterilization came into play. The eugenics movement came into play. There's a difference between positive and negative eugenics. So, there's a difference between actively killing people or actively sterilizing people to wipe them out to kind of develop this master race. We don't necessarily do that right now in America, but we definitely still have eugenics in place because we absolutely still in some parts of the U.S. sterilize people without fully explaining what that means to them. We use religion to say, well, if there's no sex before marriage and we're not going to allow you to marry, then, you're not going to have sex, you're not going to make a baby. So we in America still do many, many things to try and prevent people with disabilities having babies or producing offspring. I mentioned the marriage text before. So there's a huge inability to identify as GSM for the IDD population. So any kind of gender or sexual minority. I worked with someone in the city who used they pronouns and was really conflicted because they truly, truly, truly wanted to get medical support to help them transition. But every doctor they went to said they wouldn't help because, well, you have a developmental disability, so you don't know what you're talking about. That's not real for you. That's like you don't know. You don't know what you're talking about. And so they really struggled to get the help and the care they needed because it was just assumed that, you can't identify as anything other than, the sex you were assigned at birth, which is not true. And then you'll see a lot for anybody who identifies outside of sort of the heteronormative world. You might see people when they're younger, like being told, oh, boys don't hold hands with boys, or girls don't hold hands with girls. Like, that's not what we do. And people try and train them out of that behavior in a way that's a little more forceful than in the neurotypical population. So that oppression, that level of oppression, is there for all of the people that you might be supporting with intellectual disability. And depending on, their family situation or what part of the world they've grown up in, it will look a little different. But there will be that history of sexual oppression and trauma in there somewhere for them, just based on how society still treats them to this day. So the outcomes of sexual oppression are not great. Depression, anxiety, mental health concerns, physical health concerns, poor self-esteem, and suicide are all things that can happen as an outcome of being sexually oppressed. Those things are all true for neurotypical people who experience sexual oppression also. So it's not like this population is like super different and we have to think about them super differently. This is the same for any group of people that's experienced sexual oppression. So the term counterfeit deviance refers to a concept that if you truly don't know what the law is, then have you really committed a crime? So ignorance isn't really a defense in law, but counterfeit deviance will hold up in law a fair amount for people with IDD. So if you didn't know, if you had never been taught that masturbation in public was not okay, and you were at a stage where you touched something and it felt good, so you decided to touch it again, and you decided to do this in public one day, is it really your fault? And should you go to jail for that, or do you just need to be educated? In New York City, we are doing a better job of if something comes up criminally, we are doing a better job of meeting that person where they're at and bringing someone like me in to figure out, was that really a crime, or did they truly not know what they were doing? And if they really didn't know what they were doing, what education can we give them so it doesn't happen again? So that would be the only outcome that is a little different in this population. But if people don't have that education and they're just feeling really horny, they might do something that they've seen in the media that they think is okay because they've seen it. They might, recreate a scene from a movie because they think, well, if it worked for Tom Cruise, it should work for me too, kind of a thing. But the rest are outcomes that would be true for any group. Okay, so consent. Consent is where things get a little different. Consent is where this population is viewed differently. So in America, it is presumed that adults have the capacity to engage in a sexual relationship once they've reached the age of consent. The age of consent is different across the states in America, but it is presumed that once you've reached that age that you have the capacity to consent. So there's a difference between affirmative consent and capacity to consent. Now, I'm sure you guys are all aware of that. You folks are all aware of that, so I'm not. But where it comes to people with intellectual disabilities, it's a little different. So in New York, the age of consent is 17, and after that, affirmative consent is required in each and every sexual encounter. that should be something that we are all familiar with. For people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, however, the capacity to consent is not automatically assumed when they turn age 17. They have to sort of demonstrate their capacity. Once somebody with IDD has demonstrated they have the capacity to consent, then, as for any of us, affirmative consent is required in all future sexual encounters. If someone is deemed incapable of providing consent, then anyone else who's engaging with sexual behavior with them is technically committing a crime, regardless of whether or not that person seems to have provided affirmative consent. So there might be some questions about that because that might be a little confusing. So I'm going to go into it a little bit more, but feel free to keep writing those questions. So if the cognitive impairment is present, then capacity to consent is no longer presumed. So to determine the capacity to consent, unfortunately, it is incredibly different across all of the states in America. So New York, which kind of, I'm not an American, but New York is one of the most conservative states, and that really surprised me. But these states, Alabama, Colorado, Hawaii, Idaho, New York, and New Mexico, are the most conservative states when it comes to the sexuality of people with IDD. So in order for someone with IDD to have capacity to consent in these states, they have to understand three things. So they have to understand the nature of the act, meaning if someone says, do you want to have sex? They know what sex means. If somebody uses a term, if somebody says, I want a blowjob, do you know what a blowjob is? Do you know what you're saying yes to? Like, do you understand what's happening? And if you're not sure, do you have the capacity to ask, like, what's a blowjob? Oh, oral sex. Oh, I know what oral sex is. Like, I just hadn't heard that term before. But they have the capacity to figure that out. They also have to understand the potential consequences. I will tell you why New York is more conservative. Well, I'll tell you about some other states in a second, and you'll see the difference. Somebody just asked the question, why is New York one of the more conservative states? So I'll explain that in the next slide. So as well as the nature of the sexual conduct, they have to understand the potential consequences. So that could be pregnancy, could be a potential consequence. STIs could be a potential consequence. And then also things like social stigma could be a potential consequence. There might be parts of the world or parts of the town that you're living in where it doesn't matter what sex you're assigned at birth. You can wear whatever outfit you want, regardless of which gender it's typically associated with, and you're going to be fine and safe and happy. There are other parts of New York where that would not be true, and you might be at risk for presenting in a different way. So just sort of knowing and recognizing that there are potential consequences there. The third one is ridiculous to me because everybody's morals are different, but the law currently says that you have to understand the moral quality of the act. Now, in New York, the way that New York law chooses to interpret that is, do they understand the legal components? So do they understand that it's not okay to have sex with somebody under the age of consent? Do they understand that sex with animals is not legal? Do they understand that forcing someone to have sex is not legal? Things of that nature. So do they fully understand the laws? Now, if they're able to meet these three criteria, then they are considered as having the capacity to consent. If it's been documented either legally or clinically that you have this capacity, then it cannot be removed from you. So the example I like to give is Brock Turner, the Stanford rapist. He went to jail for a very short period of time and is a free man now. He did a bad thing, but his capacity to consent has not been revoked. So if he now has another sexual encounter with somebody else and they both provide affirmative consent, that's okay for them, if that makes sense. What people will often fight for with people with IDD is that if they make a mistake, a counterfeit deviant mistake, or if they perpetrate a sexual assault themselves, people will fight to have this, like, well, then they don't have capacity to consent. We have to remove that from them. We have to have it documented that they don't have that capacity. And that doesn't help anyone, that's not true. If they had the capacity to consent, they truly understand it and really should just go through the legal process like anybody else. The only reason we would ever change someone's capacity to consent from a yes to a no is if they had a traumatic brain injury or if their cognitive capacity changed because of something like dementia. There are no other reasons that you would remove that once it had been given to them. If they're deemed as not having the capacity to consent, you can always go back and educate and figure out where those gaps in knowledge are and educate until they meet the criteria. So you can go from a no to a yes, but you can't go from a yes to a no. Okay, so then in these states, these are sort of like the mid-level states. They're not as conservative as New York, but they are not the least conservative either. So here, they still have to understand the nature of the sexual act and the potential consequences, but they don't need to understand the law, which seems a bit silly, honestly, because the law is, an important thing for us all to understand when it comes to sexual acts. And then New Jersey is the least conservative, and they just say that the person has to understand the nature of the sexual act. So if someone asks you to do something and you understand what that is and you say yes, you don't need to understand anything more than that. So there's a fairly big difference, and it's interesting that New York and New Jersey are so close, but are truly so different. So determining consent, there's an awareness of having a choice to engage or abstain so that they know I don't have to say yes to every encounter, the ability to make a choice, awareness of the nature of the activity and its potential risks and consequences, understanding what constitutes sexual expression and possible needs in regards to restrictions of time, place, and behavior. So, really understanding that, masturbation is great and everybody should do it more often, but only in private places. Doing that outside has the potential consequence, has legal ramifications. It has a lot of potential consequences. So they have to fully understand that. Understanding that certain behavior might be considered unacceptable or immoral. So that's unfortunate that people have to kind of think about those things, but we don't want to set people up to fail. So if someone comes to you and shares that they enjoy something that's sort of not part of mainstream culture, that's great and that's wonderful for them. But we do have a responsibility to educate them that not everybody is going to be as happy for you. Not everybody is going to fully understand what it is you're interested in, and people might judge you or might not be kind to you or whatever the case may be. Understanding how to prevent pregnancies and STIs, and understanding that sexually assaultive behavior is prohibited and exploitative behavior is inappropriate. Movies are, a lot of fun. People like to watch them, but the whole romantic comedy situation can be really, really problematic. And I think that we're starting to notice this more as a community, that, some of the messages that are sent in romantic comedies are very male-centric, and there are a lot of abusive behaviors that we see, but we call them romantic or love, and it's not really what it is. That has gotten a lot of my clients into trouble in college settings because they're truly just mimicking what they've seen and are trying to, fit in and trying to be like everybody else, but don't recognize that some of the things they're doing would be considered inappropriate. So informed sexual consent, the sexual consent determination, there are two ways that this can be done. So there's a Category B consent, or a Category A consent, or a Category B consent. So Category A is determined verbally. So a trained clinician would meet with a person and have a conversation and review some scenarios, ask a lot of questions, and see if they have the ability to meet those three criteria for New York for being able to provide consent. If someone is not able to communicate verbally, it does not mean that they are not able to give consent. So the level B consent means that that we observe responsible interpersonal behaviors. So it's more of like an observation of, this person's come into our service and we know that they're having sex with someone, and we've seen them say no, we've seen them say yes. They know how to make choices in other areas of their life, and so we believe they have the capacity to transfer some of those skills. Category B is very rare and would not be something that would come up really ever in a college setting. You would mainly be looking at Category A. And you might be working with someone who doesn't use words to communicate but has the cognitive capacity to answer these questions. So whether they're typing it or using pictures to answer or whatever is all totally okay. It doesn't have to just be verbal expression, but there's a difference between them answering the questions or us having to observe their behavior. Now, these consent determinations are not things that every person with a disability has, right? And a lot of people with IDD don't know that this is even a thing that applies to them or that they could have on their file. What often happens, and when I worked for the Special Victims Unit, people would come in and we'd have no idea. Like, the first question is, are they consenting? We don't know. Nobody knows. So then I would have to come in and do that consent determination to see, regardless of whether they said yes or no, they really don't have the capacity, so a crime has still been committed, or, they do have the capacity to consent, and I'm sorry that the guardian feels very upset about what happened, but they had the capacity to consent and they said yes, so really there is no crime. So not every person that you interact with will know if they have a sexual consent determination, because not everybody goes through this. It is something that I think should be done proactively with people, and it should be offered to people that, you can access this service, because it allows people to receive that education if they are lacking in certain areas, so that they can make the best choices for themselves and they can keep themselves as safe as they possibly can, whether they're in college or, just throughout the rest of their lives. So it's definitely a service that is offered at several clinics that you could refer them to. Okay, so guardianship is a really tricky concept that is very, very misunderstood. So guardianship for a person with an intellectual and developmental disability is not guaranteed. So it is extended to the age of 21 often. But if people want to continue, if a parent wants to continue to be someone's guardian, they have to go to court to be appointed the legal guardian. They're not just automatically the guardian because they're the parent of a child with a disability. It just doesn't work that way. They're currently under the process of revamping what guardianship looks like to give more power back to the person and less power to the guardian. But the guardians do not have anywhere near as much power as they might think that they do. So you might experience people saying, parents calling and saying, well, I'm the guardian, I need to know certain information. If they don't have the paperwork to prove they're a guardian, they're not a guardian. They're just an interested family member, which is lovely, but does not mean you have to share any information with them. If they have the paperwork, it is still not okay to just share all information with them. It's really up to the person you're working with. Do you want them to know? Do you want support in sharing with them that maybe a sexual assault has taken place? Do you want them to know? Do you not want them to know? It's really up to that person. It's not up to us to say, well, we just have to tell them. Parents and guardians will fight this often because they feel like they should have more rights and more invested, the ability to make choices and decisions for their children with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And the way I try and explain it to them is that sexuality is a human right. It's a basic human right. It's the United Nations describes it as that. The World Health Organization describes it as that. It is a legal human right, as is food, shelter, and drink. And so what I try and explain to them is, in the same way that if you called me and said, please stop feeding my child who's currently in your care, I wouldn't be able to do that. I wouldn't be able to withhold a basic human right from someone just because someone's parent or guardian told me to, because that's a basic human right that they have the ability to access. Sexuality is the same thing. A guardian does not have the legal right to say you can't provide education. They do not have the legal right to to stop you from accessing health care for people, for accessing birth control, for supporting someone through an abortion. They do not have the legal right to stop any of those things from happening if the person is able to make those decisions for themselves, regardless of whether they have guardianship status. It's a confusing thing only because most of the guardians and the parents don't understand that. So parents think they're guardians when they're not. Guardians think that they have full rights over every part of their child's life, and they just don't. It's just not legally how that works. Not all people with IDD have legal guardians, as many are able to make decisions for themselves, especially those enrolled in college programs. If they've made it to college, they're probably able to make a fair number of decisions themselves. Without court documents, as I mentioned, family members are not automatically guardians, but many people don't know that. It's the responsibility of staff to work with the victim and ask them what they want. And again, like I said before, if they want you to contact a family member, you can support them with that, but you do not have to tell them just because they have a disability. You do not have to call someone's family member. And when you think back to the statistics about abuse and how often people with IDD are abused by family members, you might be calling the abuser to report something to that. Like you might be, doing more harm than good by trying to involve a family member. And if they think that everything they share with you is going to be reported to a family member, then you've just become another person that they can't talk to. So you should make that, clear with people when you're working with them. You're an adult. I wouldn't call somebody else's mom or dad about this or whoever else about this. So I'm not going to talk to your family without your explicit consent either. Okay, and that is it for the background. Like I mentioned before, part 2 is sort of like, now you know a little bit about disability and sexuality. What do we do with this? What are the best practices for teaching? What are the best practices for supporting people in this population? So I think
I have a lot of questions for you, Kat.
Oh, well, I figured you would, so I tried to wrap it up a little quick.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks, folks who have been sending them in. Keep on sending them either to me directly, as most folks have been doing, or a couple in the group chat as well. So I'm going to start with a couple that we got about guardianship. Somebody reached out sharing that they often struggle, they work at a hospital, and they often struggle kind of in the emergency room. If somebody has come into the emergency room and the provider perceives them to have an intellectual or a developmental disability, then kind of the automatic the presumption is that they should call the parents. Kind of if you have any tips about how to educate about the fact that this isn't a must over the age of 21, or other resources that a provider could use at that point to kind of keep the conversation moving forward if they're struggling.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just looking actually, because I believe I have it on a slide for next time, but I'm wondering if I can, if I don't have it, I'll get it. So there is actually a really good sort of like graphic that a lot of hospitals and different places use, and it's sort of like who to call and when to call. And it kind of like it's like a flow chart that walks you through, who are we reporting this to someone? If we're reporting it, who are we reporting it to? Are we calling family members? Things like that. For the most part, like you want to work with the person and really go from what they're telling you. If they're telling you no, if they're saying do not call, and it goes the same for like rape kits and things. It doesn't matter if you've got a guardian next to someone saying I want you to do this rape kit because I want justice to be served. If that person is telling you no, like don't touch me, or is like pulling away or pushing you away from trying to touch them, then you're not going to do it, because conducting a rape kit on someone that doesn't want to have a rape kit conducted, I mean, that's just another type of sexual assault. So we really want to just meet the person where they're at and try and work with them. And as I'm sure you would with anyone, is there someone we can call? It doesn't have to be a family member. It doesn't have to be the parents. Just, is there someone we can call? And if not, then if they don't want that, then they don't want that, And then once you've treated the person and they're ready to be discharged, if there's like a safety concern about how they're getting home, then you might want to, revisit that about, is there someone who can come pick you up? Can we help you get a cab? Things like that. But if they don't want to have their guardian contacted, we really should respect that.
Great, thank you. Kind of in a similar vein a little bit, somebody asked if there are avenues to report providers who are not kind of responding to somebody with IDD in the most respectful way. So kind of the question came right after you were talking about the individual with who was nervous about using they-them pronouns because they might get shut down. Is there any avenue to kind of either refer for additional training or report somebody if they are not treating somebody with IDD?
So I actually supported this individual with reporting that physician to the ADA.
Okay.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act is certainly a reportable, you can certainly make reports to them. Unfortunately, there are so few people that know about how to best provide good care to this population that you really just have to do your research in your area and figure out, like, okay, that didn't work for you. Let's see where we can get you in. And outside of, I've made several formal complaints, sometimes file complaints with a hospital directly, and kind of go above that person and report to the board of the hospital or the board of the clinic or whatever. And then, it's 2019. There's a lot of sort of information that you can put out there on the internet, and so there's definitely a lot of information about, this provider is not a safe space for people with intellectual disabilities. This provider does not know how to best support someone. And then it's just about looking. There are so few providers that truly specialize in this. So depending on what area you're in would depend on who you would be referred to.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to remember if this is in part 2 or not, so correct me if it is. But somebody asked about avenues for reporting a caregiver.
Yes, so the Justice Center is who you would report. Either the Justice Center for a care provider or Adult Protective Services.
Great.
Either way would work. So Adult Protective Services would work for everybody. And there are contact numbers on our next, in the next webinar. And then the Justice Center, if somebody receives services that are like provided by the government, so maybe they live in a group home or a supported apartment, or maybe they come to college with you, but they also do like a respite group or some other type of group, a recreational group with an agency, you could report them to the Justice Center. Mm-hmm. Okay. But Adult Protective Services is pretty good about pushing you in the right direction and getting you to where you're supposed to be.
Great, thank you. I also got a question on your recommendations for policies. So something like stalking behavior, when it needs to be, for example, a school-wide policy that is relevant for neurotypical folks and kind of appropriately strict and ardent for neurotypical folks, but also needs to be mindful and inclusive of how other folks might be interpreting a policy. Do you have any recommendations with that in mind, and the questions about stalking in particular?
I think that it would, these things often fall under counterfeit deviance, where somebody doesn't fully understand a policy and then they do the thing they weren't supposed to do, but they didn't really understand why. A lot of policies that are available to neurotypical students are not necessarily made available in a way that's easy to understand by others. So and we talk a lot about this more next in the next one, but are you thinking about the language you're using? Are you thinking about the font type that you're using? Are you offering a service where somebody will sit down with you and review that with you? So if you have questions, any policy, you should have that information like any other student. And if that's going to be harder for you to do alone, are we providing that so that, you're really explaining it so people do understand what's expected and what's okay and what's not okay? Those types of things can be useful. It's a tricky balance between sometimes people out of kindness, because we still have this sort of pitying view towards some people with intellectual disabilities, and it's sort of like, wow, they made it into college, like we put them on this pedestal of like, oh my gosh, like, isn't it so cool that like we have this disabled person that was able to do this very normal thing. Mm-hmm. And so when they do make mistakes, some people are afraid to hold people accountable because they're trying to be kind. And sometimes doing that is the least kind thing you can do because you're not teaching them the proper lesson that this behavior really isn't acceptable and it really isn't okay to be doing this. So I would say if somebody broke a policy, to kind of really assess, did they understand the policy? Like, did they get it? Did they know it? And if they didn't, maybe they get a pass the first time, but they have to be made aware of it. They have to fully understand it. If something else happened, they have to be held accountable just like anybody else would be. It's not fair to them to kind of have them skate through life as these special, innocent, whatever pedestal we put them up on, because we're all just people.
Actually, I kind of like what you were saying, the option to sit down and review a policy and talk through it. If, maybe encouraging schools to have a go-to person for that's a resource that they offer for every which policy they have. And oftentimes, especially with colleges and universities, students have to sign something, right, that says that they understand it. So maybe some sort of resource where before you have to sign that, maybe you don't have to sign it until you're on campus if that resource is on campus, because I know oftentimes those kind of student conduct codes you kind of have to sign before you start the academic year. Maybe a little bit of wiggle room if you are seeking out one of those services.
Right.
Cool.
And I think
somebody... Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say that I think that there's an assumption that, I think of how many times I've had to sign those things and how I don't read them because you just sign them because they're pretty much the same everywhere. And, I consider myself a good person who's not going to be engaging in any of those. I'm not going to plagiarize. I'm not going to stalk. I'm not going to commit, sexual assault. So I don't read them, honestly. And I wonder how that's probably very true for a lot of people. But I have an awareness just from life experience of what those expectations are. And some people with IDD might not have that same experience to truly understand what is expected and what is okay.
Thank you. Okay. Somebody asked about if you have the capacity to consent, but in that specific case you had not provided consent. Kind of, do you ever struggle if somebody's trying to report to law enforcement? There is somewhere from a proactive sexual consent determination documentation that they do have the capacity to consent, but in that case they're trying to really indicate the fact that they didn't. Kind of any strategies or pitfalls, challenges there?
It's a huge challenge to get anyone to understand the difference between affirmative consent and capacity to consent. And those conversations, especially with law enforcement, can be challenging. But you just have to keep trying to break it down to people. Yes, they have the capacity, but they didn't say yes. Yes, I have the capacity. It doesn't mean I can't ever be raped. You just have to kind of really just keep pushing it because people don't understand the difference between the two. And just because someone has capacity doesn't mean they want to say yes to every single sexual encounter that comes their way. So it can be useful to work with local law enforcement and provide trainings to them. I've done a number of trainings for different police departments, mainly in Brooklyn. And that can be really useful to try and provide some of that information to help them understand. And there's such implicit bias and there's such, I've had police officers have said to me, I just don't understand. I don't believe that this person would have been raped. They wear an adult diaper, they this, that, and the other, and I just don't understand why somebody would rape them. And so providing some of that education proactively can be really useful in helping police understand that, it's not about what this person looks like. It's about power and control, and we should be believing everybody. But obviously that's hard in the neurotypical population also.
Thank you. Another question just came in the chat box. What are your thoughts on concerns about ensuring that policies adequately address IDD individuals without singling them out with regard to specific education on campus?
I mean, I think that, I know that people provide a lot of kind of community sexuality education across campuses. And it's not about singling them out. It's about making sure that whatever type of education you're providing is truly accessible to all. And so in the next webinar, we're going to talk about ways to do that to truly be inclusive, different ways to present materials, different types of activities that will resonate with different learners. When we talk about sex, even people who are super comfortable will often slide into using innuendos and making jokes, and they are so not helpful for people, especially for people on the spectrum. can really struggle to understand those jokes and know, where does the fact end and the joke begin kind of thing. And so it's not about singling people out. It's about making sure that any education you provide is truly accessible to all.
Okay, thank you. All right, sifting through my questions from during the training. All right. Somebody asked any advice you would have to kind of how to proceed or interact if you're working with somebody, maybe you're presenting, and or maybe it's in a one-on-one situation and there's no demonstrated diagnosis, but you're kind of noticing either deficits in communication or deficits in social skills, kind of from that list you gave us at the beginning. Anything you would advise for kind of how to move forward where this might not be a conversation that the individual has already engaged in?
That will look very differently depending on the individual. But you would want to kind of tread lightly and not make any assumptions. But kind of not make any assumptions, but sort of be very factual. Like, hey, I noticed that you, when we were having this conversation, you were having a hard time staying focused. Like, is everything okay? Like, I noticed that you, I gave you this assignment or I handed out this paperwork for you to fill in, and, you keep bringing it back but without half of the pages. Whatever it is that's made you notice this, to talk about the behavior and just see if you can offer any support. And if they seem kind of receptive to that, then you can certainly push a bit further and, if you have connections with a therapist or a social worker who might be able to better kind of assess the situation, you can do that. But also not everybody needs a label or a diagnosis, or if they're just sort of like, yeah, that's just kind of who I am, and yeah, my bad, whatever. Like, if they don't seem interested in getting any extra help or support, then, we don't want to overstep too much, because then we fall into the territory of we're trying to make people fit into our world as opposed to, really just being appreciative of people's diversity and differences.
Absolutely. And it's a kind of similar vein. We got a question about kind of statistics and prevalence of folks with intellectual disabilities, intellectual developmental disabilities, and kind of understanding that there is a spectrum. In terms of quote-unquote mainstream schooling, this person asked kind of, can we always expect to be interacting with folks with IDD? Should we always expect that? And should we be kind of catering some of our language to bear that in mind?
I think that it's not always about IDD also, like you're going to also encounter people who don't speak English as a first language, and you're going to encounter people that are visual learners or kinesthetic learners, or, everybody learns and interacts a little bit differently. And so by making our materials and by making our education as accessible as possible, that will help other students too, not just students with IDD. I think we're seeing more and more students with IDD getting into college or into college programs. I know my friend has been a New York City health educator for a long, long time, and she's now out of the classroom and is more in the policy side of things. But she would often kind of be surprised by how many students she had that had different diagnoses, and she truly wasn't trained and didn't know how to address them. And then when I gave her some of the kind of hints and tips and tricks, she was sort of like, oh, but I do this for other students. Oh, but I do know how to do this. I'm just kind of afraid by the label, and I'm afraid I'm going to do something wrong or not do it justice. So yeah, accessible education should be important and should be on everybody's mind all the time. Just because there are so many different types of people, it's not just about intellectual or developmental disability.
Great. Thank you, Kat. I have two more questions that came in during the webinar, so if folks have any last ones, do go ahead and send them through the chat box now as well. But somebody asked about the marriage tax. I also had not heard about that. Is there any work being done?
Please call legislators and call people and yell at them and tell them, please remove this. It's disgusting.
Yeah, so that was the question, kind of. Is there work organizing being done against this? Is this in every state still? Is this a federal law? Kind of where
I believe
is the work
so. It's to do with Social Security. It's to do with like SSD money, and so you lose 50% of your disability benefits if you get married. If both partners get married, if both partners receive SSD, then they both lose 50%. So you're going from living on sort of like a two-people income to a one-person income, which is the complete opposite of what people typically expect to see when neurotypical people get married. It's been in place for a very long time. It's definitely part of positive eugenics rather than the negative. They're not actively removing people from society, but they're certainly putting policies in place to prevent people from living the lives that they might want to live. It comes up every once in a while, but it's not something that's been actively fought against. Like every now and then a politician will kind of pick it up and try and run with it, but it hasn't gathered any steam. So I would say if you feel compelled to do so, please email or write a letter or make a phone call to whoever your local representative is and just make them aware and this is something that you would like to change. It's certainly, there are signs if you ever go to the Disability Rights Parade in the city, in New York City, you'll see signs where people are fighting against it, but it hasn't picked up like a lot of traction, unfortunately.
Yeah, fascinating. I'd never heard about that. It seems pretty blatant in terms of discrimination.
Yep, absolutely.
And then
it's sad, people. Oh no, go ahead.
No, please, Kat.
So it's sad because I've been to many people, like I've been to people's weddings, and they're not legal weddings, right? So people have ceremonies so that they don't lose their benefits. And they will maybe one of them will change their last name so they have the same last name so they can kind of tell people they're married even though they're not legally married. But I've also seen then when people are in the hospital and they'll go in and say, this is my husband, this is my wife, whatever, and they're not allowed in because it's family only.
Oh, wow.
So it really does, they won't share information because they're not related and all that kind of stuff. So it really does have a lot of, it's bigger than, it just has so many kind of issues attached to it. It's really heartbreaking.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for making us aware of it.
Yeah.
So the last question we got, I thought I'd end with this one. It's a little bit more positive, maybe proactive. Are there any kind of shows, resources, sites, chat groups, or forums that you would recommend for folks to start familiarizing themselves with? You kind of this came in right after you mentioned atypical. Is there any other kind of positive representation that you've seen, or spaces which folks who want to learn more could turn their attention to?
So when it comes to things like the media, I'm a big fan of Born This Way, a show about people with Down syndrome, because it's truly a show about them, Like it's like a reality TV show, but it's just them. Like it's no one telling anybody what to say, whatever. It's just them being them. And that I think a lot of people who have seen that have had a few assumptions challenged, which has been really good. I can put a list together for our next one because there are a lot of kind of media representation and media examples that are really useful to help with educating kind of everybody. And then there aren't that many great groups, unfortunately. Like even like the center in the city provides great groups in education for many areas, but doesn't always have groups that are inclusive of people with IDD. So I'll put a list together for our next webinar, and if people aren't coming to the next one, I'm sure we could email it out to you.
Yeah, so kind of that brings me in a great segue. I've got it up on the screen now, but part 2, practical applications for serving students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, what Enough is Enough providers need to do, is going to be on Friday, May 3rd at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to stop the recording there, but if folks could stick around for 2 minutes just to do a couple eval questions, that will be really helpful. So thank you so very much, Kat. I definitely learned a lot. I hope others did too.
Good.
And I'm just going to ask a few eval questions and then let y'all get back to your Monday.